Again at 6:30.
Sure, please.
Thank you. Mayor, Council, I have a few preliminary matters. This is Zoe Burgess, your City Clerk. The workshop meeting is being held with a quorum of City of Westlake Council physically in attendance at the Westlake Council Chambers, 4005 Seminole Pratt Whitney Road. Mayor Roger Manning, Vice Mayor Katrina Long Robinson, Councilman Patrick Paul, Councilwoman Kara Crump, Councilman John Paul O'Connor are present physically. City Manager Kenneth Castle, City Attorney Pam Booker, and City Engineer Suzanne Dombrowski are physically in attendance. City Clerk Zoe Burgess is attending via Communications Media Technology at 4001 Seminole Pratt Whitney Road. Public comments may be accepted at least 24 hours prior to the meeting utilizing the electronic comment card available on the city's website. Public comments are also permitted at the appropriate time during the meeting. The mayor will call for such during public comment, and you may participate at that time utilizing the system's virtual hand feature and waiting to be acknowledged if you wish to comment. Please note this meeting is being recorded, both voice and video, and to remember your mic may be live. I will mute any microphones that carry any feedback or interruptions. However, you can unmute yourself. Attendees joining by phone may unmute devices by selecting *6. Any person in the virtual meeting causing a disruption or being inappropriate will be removed from the meeting. If I may also remind those physically in attendance, please project your voice and speak clearly so that an accurate recording of the meeting is produced. As a courtesy, please mute your cellular devices. Thank you, Mayor Manning.
Good evening. I'd like to call to order the City Council workshop meeting Monday, March 22nd, 2021 at 6:32 p.m. Stand, please. Roll call first.
Councilman O'Connor.
Present.
Councilwoman Crump.
Present.
Councilman Paul.
Here.
Vice Mayor Long Robinson.
Present.
Mayor Manning.
Here.
We have a quorum. Thank you.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Mr. Mayor, one point, the sound system is being worked on. It's not up and running yet. We got a couple more things to do on it, but so everybody needs to project their voice to make sure it's covered by the microphone.
Thank you, Mike. Useless. Right? They're not live. I guess that's the only mic that we have is the little round mic there.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, on the agenda for this evening, 2 items. Item A, conflict resolution update, and B, chapter 5, discussion and clarification.
Mr. Mayor, we have with us this evening Dr. Dale Sugarman, who walked us through the conflict resolution, who will come up now and do his presentation and update, and we'll go from there.
Thank you. Mr. Sugarman.
That's the live mic. This is not.
That's not, you can stand there, it'll pick you up either way.
It will pick me up.
Yes.
Great. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to make a presentation to you this evening. My name is Dale Sugarman, and I've spent a number of weeks working with your city manager and your city attorney. I want to tell you about the work that we've done, but first I'd like to introduce myself so that you have an idea as to why I took on this assignment in the first place. I'm a retired city manager, having spent 42 years in the profession. I'm a credentialed manager with the International City Management Association. I hold a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science. I hold a master's degree in organizational behavior, and I have a PhD in global leadership. I go by Dr. Sugarman only when I'm making reservations at a restaurant. My firm, the International Institute for Leadership Development and Training, has been in business for 15 years, since May of 2006. I've done work in both the public and the private sector, both domestically and internationally. I've lived and worked in Florida since 1988 and have been here living in Palm Beach County for the last 27 years. I actually live in Boynton Beach. It takes me an hour and 5 minutes to get here. Besides city management work and consulting work, I'm also an adjunct faculty member at Nova Southeastern University. And I most proudly serve as the Chief Operating Officer of the Andrew Red Harris Foundation, a family-run foundation. We are the folks that are building artificial reefs off the coast of Juno Beach and Jupiter. Allow me to tell you a little bit about the work Ken, Pam, and I have been doing over the last few weeks. But before I do, I want to thank both Ken and Pam because during all of our work together, they allowed me to take them down a variety of different paths. And they did so, I believe, with complete commitment, brutal honesty, some very difficult discussions, and by opening up about each of their strengths and their weaknesses. They allowed me to probe their personalities, their behaviors, their preferences, and to show them how they might not only try to see each other from different perspectives, but to modify their own behavior in order to better serve the community of Westlake. Let me share with you what the three of us went through to bring us to this point in time. Pam and I, and Ken and I, conducted 3 individual Zoom meetings, some lasting as long as 3 hours between us. We then conducted 3 face-to-face meetings that at least lasted 3 hours each, with all 3 of us in attendance. I held numerous individual phone conversations with each of them. And here's the process that we used. First, I explained to both of them that my role was to be the role of a facilitator. I did not pick sides, and I told them I did not have a dog in this hunt. I was very clear that the conflicts that they were experiencing belonged to both of them, and that only they could resolve it. My role was only to help them get to a resolution. In my work in the field of conflict management, I found that there needs to be 3 things to eliminate conflict. And most people would not even think of the first 2 things. The first is the concept of predictability. If we are constantly caught off guard by others, we ourselves can become confused, defensive, and irritated, all of which tends to lead to conflict. However, if we can predict patterns in others before those patterns happen or while they're happening, we can usually react to those patterns and then, with a little bit of training and a little bit of experience, deal with them much more effectively. So the first concept is the concept of predictability. The second concept is the concept of understanding. We are all unique individuals, and each of us has our own way of thinking, doing, acting, and reacting. If we understand and appreciate the diversity that exists between us, we can often eliminate natural conflict. Because we can begin to understand others and the fact that they are different from us. And different can be a great thing. It's okay to be different. Being different, some call it diversity, can add to any effort. If we were all the same, it would be a pretty dull world. Diversity is important to any organization. But the trick is to appreciate the value that differences or diversity can bring to the table. And so with predictability and understanding, it's much easier to get to the third concept of trust. And frankly, that is what I think this was all about, trust. And it was pretty obvious to me right when I got engaged that there was a considerable lack of trust between Pam and Ken. And so over the course of the past 2 months, we've worked on concepts of predictability and understanding. And that's what took us the most time. First, learning how to better predict how the other might act or react in a particular situation. Now, I use the Myers-Briggs type indicator. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. I'm seeing some nods of the head, and that's great. I use that as the learning tool for teaching each of them how not only to better predict how something may take place, but also to understand how and why the other reacted and behaved the way they did in any particular situation. In the beginning of our effort, I asked each of them 13 different probing questions. And I'll share just a few of those with you so you get a sense of those probing questions. For example, I asked, are you willing to share with me the personal impact this conflict has had on you? I wanted to understand how it was affecting each of them. I asked, are you willing to hear a different perspective? I also asked, what do you think is your part in creating the conflict or in keeping the conflict going? I asked, what ideas do you have to meet both of your needs? That was a tough question for them to answer. And then I asked, do you think you might need to change your perspective? And I asked, are you wise about the battles you choose to fight? Based upon my past experience in the field of conflict management, I felt as though both Ken and Pam not only opened up to me, but they were brutally honest in all of their answers, in their discussions with me, and in their interactions with each other. And so we had a lot to work through because they were each initially coming from very different perspectives. And they didn't see, feel, or truly understand the other and where they were coming from. So that's what we've been working on for the past 2 months. I gave them homework assignments and challenged each of them when they fell into their old patterns of not understanding that there might be a different perspective on one of the topics they were dealing with. And then after nearly 16 hours of working both individually and together, the three of us came up with 6 commitments the 2 of them would be willing to make. And as I understand it, those 6 written commitments have been shared with you in advance of this meeting. You all have them. Great. Interestingly, when you read through those 6 commitments, what you discover is that individually and collectively, they're all relatively simple. And actions that can help folks to gain trust in each other. They simply include concepts such as, let's have better communication. Let's help others to understand what we're doing and working on. Let's provide clarity. And let's use some leadership skills. That's what came out of those 6 commitments. So as I wrap up my presentation, I would like to invite both Pam and Ken to join me up here so that they can share with you their perspective on our process and our outcomes. Have we reached the plateau of trust yet? I don't know. Only time will tell. I believe we have developed with them or for them, good predictability and much better understanding. Trust should follow, but again, only time will tell. So after Ken and Pam offer a few words of their own, and if they want to do it at their seats, that's fine too. If you have any questions of me, I'd be happy to answer them as best I can. And I want to thank you again for giving me the opportunity to work with Ken and Pam towards something that hopefully will serve the city of Westlake well now and in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you to the council. Certainly, thank you for Mr. Dale Sugarman for helping Ken and I work through this process. I want to ensure the council that it was very well worth it to work through a couple of key factors that Dale helped me understand and see differently. But I think the biggest word from all of this was communication. Is communicating more frequently, more regular meetings, not just Ken and I, but all of staff, as well as the way we've communicated with the council collectively and individually to make sure we're all on the same page. We're following the same vision, goals, and policies as set forth by the council. A test personality typing that we did was helpful for me to understand Ken's personality, his management style, how he works with things, as well as my own style. That's probably a little bit more structured, a little bit more finite, a little bit more rigid. Ken's a little bit different. So understanding those different perspectives and how we have addressed all the issues that have come before the council previously, it was clear our styles were different in the way we approached that. Again, I don't think that's a bad thing. You have different perspectives. If you communicate, you talk about them, you bring back the best possible options to the council for you guys collectively to make those decisions. The predictability was important, knowing what's going to happen next. From Ken's perspective and mine, that we wouldn't have surprises, that there's been conversations well before any meeting or any item that's brought before you collectively as a council. Staff has discussed it on our regular Monday morning calls. We should have had a meeting with you guys to discuss it before the meeting, as well as our own individual conversations. Understanding Ken's perspective is different. Sometimes that's a SID slant on the utilities item, as you're going to see some of that discussion tonight. That's okay. Understanding my perspective on the legal, okay, are we not going to have any legal issues for the city if we go this route? And what other routes or paths can we take to get there and try to work through that? If we can't get there, we can't get there, but understand the why and understand where we're trying to go together. That was important. Those diversity of perspectives that Dale has talked to you about, I think that's important. Even as you guys sit here as elected officials, your diversity of perspectives are important. They're not all aligned. They're not all the same. You see things differently. You have a different opinion and perspective based on your own life experience. So those things become important. I do want to share with you that as we've gone through this process, Ken and I have communicated a lot more than we had, previously. We got stuck on these conversations about 5. Communication had broken down. There's been several calls and conversations where it's Ken, I think we should do X, Y, and Z. What are your thoughts about that? While we're on the phone, he's sending an email to implement that, to move forward with it, to put that into practice so we can bring a better product to you as elected officials, so we can give better guidance to staff on how they bring applications forward to you. So it has helped greatly. I appreciate that effort. I appreciate that back and forth that we've had. Even with the item that's on your agenda tonight, we were going to proceed one way. We had more conversations and thoughts about it. We ended up a different place, and it's before you guys to give us direction this evening. And hopefully we can continue to move forward with all the things that are going to be before you in that manner. And I do want to thank Ken as well. Those conversations weren't easy, to talk about everything that has happened, how everybody felt about it, why, how you got there, and what can we do to fix it? What can we do to help each other? How can we do this better going forward? It was very difficult, and those were very long, exhausting meetings, but we were all very honest and open with everything that had occurred. And so thanks to you guys for suggesting this, for having us work with Dale, for having Ken and I work through this. I think we're on a better page, and hopefully we can stay on that page, give you guys the information, and let you do your job and tell us what you want once you've gotten the information. Respecting each other's opinions and differences, I think, is a healthy thing. So if we can stay on that process going forward, I think you'll have a very effective administration team here to help you implement your goals. Any questions? And I agree with all the commitments we've made. We both have it in the sleeve, so if we go astray, we can pull it out and remind each other and talk to each other about it. This is what we're supposed to be doing. This is what we're supposed to be following. If you guys have comments or questions, we'd love to discuss those with you afterwards.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Might be a little briefer, but I might ramble at the same time. I too want to thank Dale. Appreciate your longevity, where you're coming from, understanding multiple sides of the equation, and forcing both of us to dig a lot deeper than sometimes I wanted to dig. I appreciate that. I appreciate Pam's digging deeper in some of the areas that she really didn't want to go to, and it was good conversations. But as Dale said, our personalities are definitely rooted two different views, two different perspectives. See if I can summarize it. Pam is more structured, and things have to be this certain ways and stuff. I'm more flexible, and I can deal with ambiguity, and doesn't deal with ambiguity well. So that was one of our commitments, was how do I communicate with less ambiguity so she understands where I'm coming from, but she also understands sometimes that I don't have the full picture, so I can't communicate the full picture because the picture is changing minute by minute. I have glimpses of what might be. So we're working on that kind of a communication thing, which is really been helpful. I also understand where she's coming from because of the personality type. There's certain things for me to communicate better. There's also things where she's coming from a point that I'm going, wait a minute, can we be a little less rigid? Can you find me another solution? So we're working on those kind of issues. As Pam stated, different personality types don't mean we can't work together. When you have similar, it's easier to work together. When you're really kind of opposite, it just takes a lot more work. So it is a lot of work. And it's a lot of work getting beyond the statements of how somebody says something. And it does influence how you view governance, how you feel the role of government, how you understand things, where you're coming from is your perspective. It definitely influences everything we did. It's kind of mentioned that sometimes I come from a civic perspective. No, I'm coming from a city manager's perspective of let that entity do its job, we do our job. Don't get in the other entity's business. There are two distinct things. The deal that I have to deal with is because I happen to wear two hats, it's a lot more difficult for me, for everybody else to see that I'm not this. I am coming from a perspective that says separate the two. So that's out there. It's hard to deal with. Trust me, you asked me, Roger, one time, why do you do this? I don't know, it must be crazy, but I'm actually enjoying it. It's a lot of, I shouldn't say fun. I'm really enjoying what I do because by being in both roles, I understand the impacts on both sides way before things happen and try to minimize the, shall we say, negative impacts that could happen. But again, I'm here. We're committed to the 6 things that we said, and we'll keep going forward and keep working.
Yeah. I want to thank you both for devoting the time and the energy to try to resolve the problems. It's very difficult sitting back here when we have two conflicting views that are strong and sometimes, and some of the direction that we get from either side can be confusing. It really can be confusing. So the communication aspect of this, I know, has been an issue. We all of us do it, I think. When we get into a difficult situation, sometimes we back off and don't say anything, and other personalities dig into it, and it's all out there. Okay? So I appreciate the time you've spent, and Dr. Sugarman and Pam and Ken, on trying to resolve these the conflict issues and learn how we can get through this in the future without as little conflict as possible. There's no such thing as no conflict. I know that.
So there's always solutions.
There's
That's
always
the
a
key,
solution.
is trying to find the solution that we can all work with.
Well, Pam has alluded to that in the sense that as long as this council is able to get both points of view and has the opportunity to make a decision, we have an opportunity to make a decision with all of the facts and both points of view, then it makes it much easier for us to do our job. And if there's no communication, we can't do our job because we need you in order to do that. So thank you very much.
Mayor, can I react to that?
Certainly.
It's my perspective that you want as much diversity as possible.
Mhm.
You don't want disagreement. What you want is a different perspective.
Right.
So invite differences, invite different perspectives, invite diversity. Actually, again, from my perspective, it'll probably make your job harder. You know, what input do you trust? What input do you feel most comfortable with? How do you decide? Well, welcome to the world of being an elected official. That's your job. And use your staff as best you can and let them roll with as much perspective and diversity as possible. And I'd be happy, if there's any other questions, I'll stick around for a little bit.
I'm gonna open up the floor.
My only question is this process you guys are going through, is it ongoing? Does it continue? Is it done?
The work with,
Is it a wrap? What's the
Well,
story here?
as Dale said, once we're a student, we're always a student, so I'm gonna be calling them. I'm sure Pam will be calling them on things of issues and stuff that we need to talk through. It's a never-ending process. What it did for me is it helped me understand why I react certain ways to things and how to change some of those. Also, when I'm getting feedback from Pam or where Pam's coming from, I can understand where she's coming from better. So out of that and out of the communication, what I'm looking forward to is the potential of building back the trust that doesn't exist currently. And that's a key factor, because if she can't trust me to get the right information out, I can't trust her to put the right information out, or the information we agreed upon, that's a problem. Then you all get in conflicting signals, which makes your job even harder, because again, who do you believe? So I think as we're building on this, it is an ongoing process.
Yeah, let me just pick up on that. I've been a university professor for 29 years, and I think I have thousands of students. And when a class wraps up, I always offer to my students, as Ken said, once you're my student, you're always my student, so I am just a phone call away. I do not charge for phone calls. Or
Even for 3 hours? I mean,
Well,
Sometimes you might look at the phone and go, God, it's him again. You know?
I do not charge for phone calls. I do not charge for travel. I only charge when I'm doing actual work. And actually, if the elected body is interested in discovering more about your own personalities and your ability to work together and how to take it to the next level, I would be available for that. And I'd be interested in working with you if you think that's something that could be of some help. But going forward, my work with Ken and my hourly rate work with Ken and Pam is done, unless they get into serious trouble and then I got to come back officially, but I'm available by telephone.
Excellent. Thank you, guys.
Any other questions?
Okay, thank
very
you.
much. Okay. Move on to the second item on our agenda, and that's chapter 5, discussion and clarification. Who's gonna take this one, Sam? Gonna start, or Ken?
I can kind of lead off. This is kind of brought back in that, some clarity was not really understood. From my perspective, I thought we were settled after the several lengthy meetings with everybody in the November 30th. And the fact that my memo of September 2nd was said, that's what we're gonna do. The fact that the engineers had agreed to language, which is now section 11 in SID's code, that the statements from the engineers was, if that's done, I can accept a letter. That's where I thought we were. So therefore, having anything written in the city code is counterproductive, because as you do with any other, whether it's the Palm Beach County Fire Department, NFIPCRA, all these other codes, you reference them by code. In other words, you reference that entity's, that agency's standards or codes or whatever as your reference, and you utilize that. For some history, prior to, in the 80s, the late 80s, and prior to Hurricane Andrew, lots of communities used to write the electrical code pieces and plumbing code and safety codes in their thing. After the late 80s and early 90s, after Hurricane Andrew, they redid the South Florida Building Code and the Florida Building Code. Everybody scrapped it and went to referencing the National Electrical Code, the Safety Code, the Fire Code, etc., because they change from time to time as technology changes. And then the entity doesn't have to go back and rework their words to make sure they all match, and it stops a lot of confusion. So that's why I'm not sure why we're still looking for clarification. I thought we were clear back in November as to the method we were supposed to go.
Counter.
Not a counter, as Dale has taught us, it's a different perspective.
Oh, okay.
Let me give
Excuse
you
me
a
for using the wrong language.
perspective. The different perspective on here is, after several of the meetings, I received the code that the engineers had agreed upon. At the November 30th, it was my understanding or recollection from that meeting, the vice mayor was asking, had the engineers agree to the language regarding stormwater. Ms. Dombrowski at the meeting indicated that they had. There was a few minor nits. I did eventually receive that language that they had agreed upon. That is what's currently incorporated into the Chapter 5 draft that you have before you. There are several highlights in there, yellows. There were still questions for discussion, some recommended deletions from SID that we did not delete. I did not delete. I wanted to make sure everyone saw that. We would have follow-up conversations to see should that stay in or not, and discuss why it was recommended that that stays in there. You see some edits in red. Again, a couple of questions, some suggested deletion in language. I didn't think that language should be deleted. Put a little note in there for us to follow up and talk about. I did have a very long conversation with Catherine Rosmell regarding Chapter 5. And one of the first questions that came up was, what was the council's intent at that November 30 meeting? Should any of the stormwater language be in, or should it all be adopted by reference? I did not recall the council giving a directive to only adopt it by reference. The language is in there regarding accepting certification from SID. Engineer would say these requirements have been met. they would accept that by city engineer would not review all of that information. So that language has been added. Again, it's bold, highlight, and yellow for input from Sid's side. Is this the appropriate place and language? Certainly open to making some edits to that language to make sure that is clear. But that was certainly the intent, to say this section of the code would be met with the certification from Sid's engineer. Once we were sure or had a different perspective or recollection on what the council's directive was from that November 30th meeting, we asked the city clerk to provide minutes from what the motion exactly said, what council exactly said. Councilman O'Connor asked for that as well because he didn't recall either. So the question was put to all of the council members: here's the code, please take a look at it, see if you recall what was your direction and intent at that meeting. Those minutes were also provided to everyone. So for me, the simple question for all of us, again, to move forward, myself, Catherine, we have another meeting next week, Tuesday, to go through a few more, what I believe are minor changes to the code, some clarification, to try to get this on your May agenda for first reading. Is to give us some direction. Do you want this stormwater section in the code or out of the code for the city? I've not done a word for word comparison for the chapter 11. As I understand it from Sid, they're due to adopt that at their next month's meeting. It's not part of their code currently. It's my understanding the engineers agreed to it. They're both here so they can speak for themselves as to their agreement on the language. This is one of those areas we just need direction from council. My recommendation would be that it's in the code. Again, we've talked through those reasons for why that should be in the city's code, but that's at the direction of council. Could we do a by reference? Yes, you could. I think it creates it doesn't give the city the best legal argument if we had to go to court to enforce any of these provisions or force an applicant or developer to comply with these provisions if we didn't have it, or should Sid's codes change and we're not aware of those changes, it could create some discrepancy. So for me, it wouldn't be the best practice to do it in that manner. If Sid were, and again, I had this conversation with Kim, we have communicated our different perspectives on this. If we both adopt the same code, April, May, if there's a need to change that code from either entity, be it Sid or the city of Westlake, we should both be communicating and come back to both bodies and make those changes at the same time so that both entities know these are the rules for building permits for construction activity that's going to take place in the city of Westlake. And I think we could do that. Again, one of these strategies has been bi-weekly meetings with both engineers, Ken and I, on the phone to try to help work through any discrepancies that they may have as applications are moving forward. So that would be my suggestion, but I'm certainly open to input from the council, and we'll all take your directive this evening.
I have a question. Since November 30th, Ryan, have you been following the agreed language and requirements, et cetera, that was agreed to between you and Suzanne? And Suzanne, can you respond as well?
Yeah, so just kind of as a follow-up, basically we, we're reading up.
Please, excuse me, please state your name
Sorry,
for the record.
Colford and Wheeler Seminole Improvement District, 7900 Glades Road, Boca Raton, Florida. So leading up to, and then since after that November 30th meeting,
Just one question. Now, are we talking about
What's in
section 11?
What's in section 11?
So that's what we're referring to, you're referring to right now.
yeah, so basically leading up to that, we, kind of with all parties, Suzanne and I, we all, came up with the adoption, I guess you could say, of that chapter 11 and how we wanted to say from the engineering perspective. Since that date, really, we came up with that language and how everything's written. We haven't, done any changes or anything from our side from an engineering perspective. So I don't necessarily want to speak on Suzanne's part, but I think on our end, it encompasses everything that we all feel needs to be covered within the code.
in addition to that, we came up with a cover letter and a checklist item, just so that we were all both sure that everything that Sid reviewed, was that the city wanted to ensure that that Seminole Improvement District had and reviewed was covered under it. So each project, what we do is we have a list, and basically we checklist whether, yes, we received it and are okay with it, no, we did not, or if it's not applicable. So that's just kind of, as Pam said, since then we've had the bi-weekly meetings. So that's kind of on our end from the engineering perspective, what we've been doing from November 30th.
This is Suzanne Dombrowski with Chen Moore and Associates, the city engineer. So I just want to point out what Pam mentioned. These sections, they're not going to be word for word identical. The 90% of it is. There are a few things that Sid felt that they wanted to just elaborate on, and they gave us the opportunity to review them. We had no issue with it. It's really the same intent. It's just, I think, how you're saying it. So 99% of it is identical. There are a few things here and there, but again, we've all reviewed it and we are comfortable with the language in both sides.
So you're totally all right with adopting, that we have adopted this chapter 11 from Seminole Improvement?
All the standards that are in chapter 11, we think are adequate engineering standards for the city. Yes.
So it boils down to this, it seems like, whether it's put into the city's code as well as SID's or not. Is that what we're talking about here?
Yes.
That's correct.
Have you guys been using this
So-
process since November and it's been going smooth and,
Yeah, and all we've had really from this, that applies to it, the permits that we receive, we'll get, FPL gas, stuff like that, but from a stormwater management perspective for like a PUD or, a larger neighborhood, there's been one project that we had that we submitted the sort of, the checklist and all those items, but, really in the next, couple months, we're gonna have a ton of those because, where we were back in November and, we're down in the middle, yeah.
So my question would be this, I guess, is that, if something were to change in this code on the Seminole Improvement District side, chapter 11, would the city council be aware of that? How would we be notified of that there was a change, or would we have any input in any change that was suggested? Would we have be able to input as to our feelings on that and have any voting right at that point to say, no, we don't want to do that, or yes, we do?
I think with the working relationship between the two engineers on this, if there's going to be a change, the two engineers are going to be discussing that change long before me as a city manager or as a district manager or Pam is going to be involved in, legal's going to be involved in what that change might be and the consequences of that change. They're going to be, that's their tasking is, they know now that they are supposed to be looking at this on both sides to make sure both are happy, not happy, both are agreeable to what's going on in it. And if any change needs to come back, it would be coming back with full knowledge of the city engineer as well as the district engineer, and it would be communicated to both boards that this is the reason for the change or any modifications thereof.
Well, and one thing I will add to that is any changes really that, if at all, that would be happening from this point on, there's nothing major that, would be applied or changed within this code. I mean, we went through and made sure that the code covers everything from A to Z within that. So, I mean, I would anticipate if there are any changes, it would be, way down the road and minor in nature.
But it is a fact that if it was not written in our book, so to speak, and on the SID side, if we're not having the same verbiage, that SID effectively could change something at their leisure, put it in place, and then notify our engineer.
I don't know if that's necessarily the case, but I mean, for us to apply and do any type of change or anything, it would have to go through our formal process, go in front of our board or our public, hearing to be adopted. You know,
Which
I
does
will,
not at that point necessarily include Westlake, the city. I mean,
yeah, no,
I'm looking for
potentially.
that inclusion, and you know, I've made that point over and over.
Well, one thing I would be nervous about is Sid as the permit owner and the owner of the ultimate, you know, overall drainage system is the other side. The city going through and making some type of change that could affect our permits and we not being notified. So that is a little bit thing that gives us just a little bit of pause because we are the ultimate responsibility for that.
Excuse me, Mayor Manning.
Yes.
We do have a hand from Robert Diffenderfer from Lewis, Longman and Walker. If you'd like to recognize.
While we have both engineers up, still standing up, and if the questions Bob has would come up there, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you. Going back just a little bit, and I apologize for taking you back through what was a very long discussion on November 30th. On November 30th, the issue wasn't whether those standards ought to be in Chapter 5. On November 30th, the discussion was who had responsibility for the issue. And after what was a very long discussion, the vice mayor made a motion that Sid would be responsible for and perform all stormwater review. Councilman O'Connor seconded the motion and went on to observe that there's an exclusive line in the interlocal agreement. He said it's black and white. It's so clear. And it even says Sid set standards and review. It's exclusive to Sid. So coming forward from that, what we've got now is the question of whether there ought to be words in the code or simply a reference, incorporation by reference to the SID standards. And I would say to the extent that you put words in your own code and do not simply incorporate by reference, you are creating confusion, not just for SID and not just for the city, but also for third parties who have to deal with it. You've already heard the city engineer say this evening that it's not word for word. Well, if SID has responsibility for this issue and SID has the exclusive ability to set standards, then it ought to be the SID standards. If the city is using different words, then the law presumes that the city means something different. Now, I heard the city engineer say, no, it's the same intent, it's just different words. Well, those things don't work when you're in statutory interpretation. If it's the same words, then it's the same words. And if you use a different word, then you're presumed to mean something different. Now, I will take one issue with something the city attorney said, is that your position is somehow compromised if you don't have those standards set out in words in your code. You do not lose any enforceability by incorporating by reference. Cities and counties do it all the time. Ken mentioned some of it when he started, but your code already, as I understand it, incorporates other standards by reference. The city can enforce that. The city can interpret that. The city can make that real. So you're not really losing anything in position by incorporating the SID standards by reference. I just think going back to November 30th, when it was absolutely clear and the board approved that fact that SID was in fact in charge of setting those standards and responsible for and performing the stormwater review, that the natural conclusion of that position is that you adopt the SID standards by reference. Thank you.
I do have one more question.
Yes,
And
please.
we probably all got the email today about this property that's been sold and the neighbor complaining about flooding. And I am not clear whether that is then, as far as the flooding of the other property, is that something that falls in those parameters for drainage?
It becomes a code enforcement issue because that work, from what our records have shown so far, was done without permits.
I'm talking in general terms. I'm not so much talking necessarily about this project now. We'll probably get that some other time, but in general, and it's one of the points that I brought up in November that if somebody builds something, does something on their property, whether it's with or without permit, and it affects the neighbor's property negatively as far as having water on their property, how does that fall into this?
I am not an attorney, but from the administrative perspective, you can enforce any code that you caught by reference. If SID says a standard of whether it's a 1 inch of runoff has to remain on the property, et cetera, that's enforceable because they violated what that was built to. So, but I'll turn it over to Mr. Diffenderfer, one of the other attorneys, or Pam to respond in those areas. But I think that from an administrative perspective and from my experience, you can use the code and go after them. Mr. Chair.
Just do it.
For the record, and I'll try to speak as loud as I can through my mask, Tara Dewey, Lewis, Longman, and Walker on behalf of Minto PBLH LLC. I do recollect the very long discussion we took to get to this point of our discussion today. And I do recall a discussion about who had exclusive jurisdiction over these issues and a resolution to that being SID. And so I have also understood, and I have not been involved in the day-to-day drafting of Chapter 5. When I learned of this incorporation by reference concern, it is absolutely true that if you create a code in the city's code, that is a different code than SID. You are thereby challenging that exclusivity, and that's a separate code. If you do anything other than incorporate by reference, it is a separate code, a separate standard. And it does, for an applicant, create an opportunity for chaos, which we have long sought to avoid. But in an interest of seeking resolution, I recalled that when we go through site plan review, pursuant to your charter, and I believe you have an agreement with the Palm Beach County Fire Department as well, but I could not find it notwithstanding. I'm going to hand you out, if I may approach, a printout with a highlight from your adopted Chapter 2. So this is your code, Chapter 2. And on the second page is a highlight of language, I think, that you've already adopted that you could simply use to, and I have been on vacation or I would have discussed this to the attorney. I literally got back last night at 10 o'clock. So what that language says is that as part of a site plan, it's the applicant's responsibility to go to Palm Beach County Fire Department, submit our site plan, get their approval pursuant to their standards before you guys will give us an approval. It's required. Do the same thing for SID. And Palm Beach County MSTU in your charter, SID in your charter. That's how you handle it for them. That's how you handle it for SID. And we would object to doing a repetition. Pardon me, I'm losing my breath. With all the walking. A repetition of the standards in your code, because that creates a city code, which we believe is in violation, as we explained back in November, for all the same reasons of your interlocal and charter and conflict.
Okay. Just to go back myself, I don't recall anyone saying anything about including by reference in our code at that meeting. That particular part. I know there was a lot of conversation. We went through a lot of stuff that evening, but I don't remember that specific language. And if the two, my feeling is that both, if the city and SID's code was the same, exactly the same, and that then there's not a conflict, and that if there is, it was written into both, and there was exactly the same, there would be no conflict. The only conflict that we would run into is if the city or SID were to change that terminology in this code without one or the other knowing about it or agreeing to it. That I'm the same, is everybody thinking the same?
From the administrative perspective.
I don't know.
From the administrative perspective, the issue comes on interpretation of what that language really means.
So, but if you handed me, well, we got this chapter 11 from Sid tonight, and this is what you said that both of you agree on. Okay. So if this was adopted,
If a different city engineer reads it and has a different perspective and a different interpretation
okay,
of what that language means, then you have a conflict and you have an issue.
does that sound possible? I'm just trying to, I'm
It
trying
is.
to work my way through this.
Yeah, before we got into this exercise, I thought like 1 + 1 was 2 and that was that. But it's not completely true. So there are different, when you look at these codes, there are different ways to interpret them. So, and we are all on the same page on how those are interpreted now, but at the beginning, we were looking at some things a bit differently.
Which means if you have if it's sometime in the future, I don't have the two same players.
Right.
You got two different interpretations. And it's written here and it's written here. You got nothing but conflict. And that's why I say, from an administrative perspective, adopt it by reference, put it where it belongs, and coordinate.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I guess my feeling is this, is that if there's not any way, if there's a change in what Seminole Improvement District does as far as the engineering side of it, and the city, we're supposed to be together. We're one, in a sense, but we're not. And that's where we run into conflict here, because we're one and not one.
But that comes where, again, part of the thing has to be the trust. It's
Yeah.
the trust between the two entities. From my perspective, I know that Sid, because they're gonna have to live with whatever's done long-term and they're responsible for, is not going to do something irrational or crazy or do something that's going to put them in a jeopardy situation. I trust the engineers, I trust their legal, I trust their board to not do those kind of things.
Okay, I'm gonna go back to just what you just said to me. Sometime you're not gonna be the city manager and not gonna be district manager for some improvement district. We're all gonna move along in our own positions at some point down the road. Suzanne won't be in her position, or Ryan won't be, and there's gonna be a lot of changes. I should say there's gonna be changes. There's gonna be changes of roles. If at some point the engineer for some improvement district says, I don't like the way this is written, and I think we should adopt something different, and you're not there to watch what's going on because you've retired and you're laying back and eating bonbons. And then that leaves the council of the city in a position where they're not really aware of what might be going on. And I'm just concerned that there'll be a situation where something just goes away.
Well, can I say something on behalf of
Please,
Seminole Improvement
please.
District? What's a little different in this situation is that we own, the land for all the stormwater management system. And we are the overall permittee for the overall stormwater management system. So we got to look out for our well-being, which in turn is the entire, city, and then some areas that are not included within that city. So what we're worried about and what we need to be protective of is that there's nothing that is written or set in stone that could potentially jeopardize that permit or enforceability of what's in that permit. So.
Let me ask you this: what is Sid's? I think I know the answer, but what is Sid's procedure for the event you're leaving? And by your own words, and by Dan's words, this is open for interpretation. So now you have a new engineer coming in and interprets whatever you thought one way, a different way.
Well,
How
I
is
mean,
it-
they would have to go through the process of going through either, modifying the South Florida Water Management Permit that, this is within the Seminole Permit District, or going through the proper procedures of changing the language. I mean, I don't foresee that happening, not to say that it would, but
We
I mean-
tried to make the language as
yeah, and we've had
open to interpretation as possible.
And we've had two separate engineers looking at it, one from
Along
the
with
city
us, yeah.
perspective and one from the city perspective, and we've, come to an agreement on that. So,
Mr. Mayor, may I be heard again, please?
Yes.
Thank you. Bob Diffender for Seminole Improvement District. Two things to remind people of. There is a mechanism in the interlocal agreement for the parties to coordinate, and the development of standards would be one of those instances. But more importantly, back to the discussion in November 30th, the issue again, Mayor, you're correct. The issue was not whether to incorporate language in the code. That wasn't what was being discussed. What was being discussed was who had the power and the responsibility to do it, period. And that discussion was resolved in favor of SID. That is SID's responsibility under both the charter and the interlocal agreement. So what we're talking about here is really just trying to replicate the SID standards in the city code. And for the reasons that Ken and Tara have both said, it's a bad idea to try. The simplest, the most clean, the most efficient, and the least confusing way to do it is simply incorporate them by reference. If in the future those standards need to change, there will be a conversation between SID and the city about what that should be. If the regulatory requirements change or something like that, then we have to respond. But the issue today is whether you're trying to simply copy the SID standards into your code. And we're saying that's not a good idea.
May I?
Please.
First and foremost, I want to thank the engineers. I think the one great thing that really came out of this process is you guys started working really well together. You didn't even need Dr. Sugarman. So I think that's wonderful. But guys, why are we still talking about stormwater? I mean, honestly, it's enough. It is black and white. It's in the interlocal. This is the best analogy that I can think of. You can have two extremely perfect 10 capable drivers, right? If they're both trying to drive that same car, that car is going to crash. And in this particular case, the car belongs to Sid. It's their car, and we're trying to get our hands on the steering wheel. That's what's happening. I can't stress it enough. I think I've said it before. We really need to let Sid be Sid. Let them do what they're here to do, and adopt by reference. I mean, let's stop talking about stormwater. I'm tired. I'm exhausted.
I second that. I completely agree here.
My concern is, I wish we would have had clarification that night, if we needed clarification. And I feel like if we don't allow, if we made the motion and the motion passed, if we don't have, allow Sid to, be Sid, then they will have conflict, right? There will be conflict. And so I agree, allow it to go by reference, especially if we're looking at it, I underline, especially, standard is required for site plan approval, meaning they would have to get approval. So they aren't, and I think we said it earlier, it's a trust factor among us at this point. And that's unfortunate. And so we're trying to find our way, but I agree. If Attorney Booker is just asking for clear direction, we thought clear direction was given on the 30th, apparently it wasn't, and so let's give her clear direction so we can move forward with this.
How much more black and white do we need to make it?
Right, it says it right in the interlocal agreement.
Let's
You made that decision.
put it to bed now and forever, so we don't ever have to talk about stormwater again.
Mayor, council, if I may just add a couple of comments, to the record to respond to a couple other items that have been said tonight. My legal concern and why the recommendation was to leave this language in, there's a sentence that's been requested by Sid after the fact to add to the chapter 5 that says Sid has exclusive jurisdiction for all things stormwater. If there were ever a situation where the city was trying to enforce on a developed applicant not meeting these, something went wrong in the field, we would be challenged by that applicant in court on jurisdiction if it says exclusive jurisdiction is all to Sid. The city would not have the legal right to enforce these if our own documents say Sid has exclusive jurisdiction. So that was my legal perspective concern with putting it in that manner, is you're taking away one of the enforcement tools the city would have to bring the applicant developer into compliance. It's not any particular developer, but things happen in the field, things go wrong in the field, sometimes happen. And there may be a legal need to enforce that, address it, or correct it from both Sid's side and the city side. And so we would collectively have more tools, more opportunities to address that. So that was the legal concern. In terms of the conflicts that have been talked about tonight and were talked about on November 30th, the resolution of that conflict, we have that language already proposed in here. It's not going to be an interpretation between the Sid engineer and the city's engineer. The city's engineer is accepting certification from Sid engineer. These requirements have been met. All the boxes have been checked. You can take this. You don't have to do the duplicate review and all those other items of discussion that were talked about in November 30th. So I think that would address any of the potential conflicts Dewey agrees that the applicant is concerned about, as well as Mr. Bissinger raised that he had concerns about both on the 30th as well as this evening. My other and final point on this is trust but verify. Absolutely, we're working through the trust issues with everyone at the table, collectively. I trust that Sid wants to do the right things. I've always said that to engineers. I don't think anyone in here has some bad intent or motive with what they're doing. It's how do you protect the city, the residents, this council going forward. From my perspective, having that language until we get further along in the process with everyone, make sure that everyone is held accountable. But I will certainly take direction from the council. You see it differently. We will bring this at your May meeting. We still have another meeting next week. We missed the deadline. We'll bring this forward for final adoption and move forward. And those are my final thoughts.
So I just want to be perfectly clear. What's the direction? I don't want to have to revisit this again.
The
I
motion
want to make
should,
sure everybody understands. Does it have to be a motion? Is it simply
Yes.
direction?
yes,
Yeah.
You can't do a motion.
you're just
at a
giving
workshop.
direction.
It has to be general discussion and direction. The consensus of the board is to say adopt by reference, then the consensus of the board would be not by reference. That statement is all that's needed for the city attorney and myself to move forward.
So I'd like to say adopt by reference.
So this is not necessarily a vote, this is just consensus.
Just direction.
So I guess everybody has, you obviously, Councilman O'Connor, you already made your decision.
I'm very,
And so,
I'm tired of talking about
I guess
stormwater.
everybody has, they don't necessarily have to say what your position is tonight, correct?
Well, it would be helpful if each board member stated what they believe is the proper direction for us to go. It would add additional clarity from my perspective. So I would say each board member give us your perspective on which way we should go.
Okay.
And wherever the majority of the board goes, that's where we'll go.
I would like it to say adopt by reference.
Councilman Paul?
No.
Not clarity. Both sides. Katrina?
The city can incorporate the city standards on them.
So, at this point, I would say there's nothing more to talk about, really. It's the consensus of the council at this point to adopt by reference. So I think we've answered our question here.
Thank you.
Okay. And with that, we have to move on to city attorney, excuse me, city council comments.
I start?
You start.
All right. Make it short, make it brief. Just want to thank all my colleagues up here for their leadership. I know it's not always easy because we don't always agree, but you know, at the end of the day, you know, we're making things happen, and that's what's most important. I really want to thank the city attorney and the city manager for going through the process with Dr. Sugarman. Seems like we're getting somewhere, and I think it's great. The only thing I would add is that I'd like to see, and I don't know if this is the case or not, but I'd like to see less getting hung up on winning or getting your way, and more just about resolving the conflict. I'm completely going to butcher the quote, but there's something my dad used to say. It was, you can fight 10 battles and win 10 battles, and that's not victorious. But if you win one battle without a fight, that's victorious. So if, you know, take that for what you want, but I'm really glad you guys are going through the process, and I think it's great. And hope we get somewhere. Thanks, guys.
Councilman Paul.
Don't have much else to say. I don't know if it is too late or not for the next council meeting. I would really love to talk about code enforcement, and how we're going to go on in the future. We have got to protect people that are in houses, that are future buyers. So I really would love to talk about that. That's about all I have for today.
Okay. Councilwoman Crowe.
I don't have any comments. I thank everybody for being here tonight.
Vice Mayor.
No comment?
Okay. I'd like to thank everybody for their efforts. It's a very tough job we all have here, making decisions that affect a lot of people. It affects the livelihood of the developers. It affects the livelihood of our citizens. And it's some of these decisions are just very, very difficult to make, knowing that what you say, what you decide on, could affect somebody 30 years from now. It may not be today, tomorrow, it could be a long time down the road. So I'd like to thank everyone, and Dr. Shuban, thank you for your efforts working with Pam and Ken. And that wraps it up for me. City Attorney.
I don't have anything further this evening either, just thank you guys. And thank you for the directive. It's clear for Catherine, myself, Ken, while we're here. Those sections that were referenced in Chapter 5 Stormwater Code will all be deleted, and we'll add the language to adopt Article 11 by SID by reference. So we'll work that language out hopefully next week and wrap that up.
Thank you. City Manager, Mr. City Manager.
I do thank all of you for the additional clarification. Councilman Paul, I will provide an update of where we are in code at the April meeting. I have been in discussions with one of the other municipalities about utilizing through an agreement their code instead of having to set up our own board. Working out those details now. I should have an update for you at the April meeting. And yes, Sometimes residents go awry. Sometimes they don't believe that you mean business. And yes, it's time to, I was hoping it would be further out than it is, but it's time to
But we can clearly see that potential.
drop
Bias.
the hammer on some that have knowingly violated a number of conditions and issues. So we're working with it. And that's all I have.
Thank you, sir. That leads us to the public comments portion of our agenda. Do you have any public comment?
Mr. Diffenderfer, your hand is still raised. Do you have additional comments?
That was a mistake, nothing further. Thank you, Mayor.
Ms. Dewey, do you have any additional comments?
No, I don't. Thank you.
Okay, we'll give the virtual audience a moment to raise their virtual hand. If you wish to make a comment, please raise your virtual hand, state your name and your address. If anyone in the virtual audience wishes to make a comment, please raise your virtual hand or unmute your device. If you're a call-in user, please press *6 to be unmuted. State your name and address. Mayor, I see no additional comments.
Thank you very much. With that, if there's no public comment, then we'll end our meeting at 7:46 p.m. Thank you.
See ya.
You're supposed to get there Sunday, we didn't get there until Wednesday. Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everybody. Bye, see you guys.
So, yeah, I got it on the screen. I wanted to know.